Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you at the Darwin Lecture Theatre and to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture. Today it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jann Matlock, who is a senior lecturer at the UCL Department of French. And she's going to talk to us about perhaps some of the lesser-known aspect of Victor Hugo's work, which is his work with photography, in particular during his time in exile on the Isle of Jersey. So we look forward to hearing about this new and exciting research. Welcome, Jann.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Welcome. I'm glad to be a lecturer today that no one is protesting. My class before this had trouble getting going, so I'm going to see what I can do to show you a lot of pictures, and we'll do our best. I'm just going to move this slightly there. Hopefully it's all still happy. It's all still happy. Okie doke. The collage explicitly names exile as its subject. Created in Guernesey in 1855-56, after the expulsion of the proscrits, or the banned men, who had been thrown out of Jersey, or Jersey, I guess you say here. I say it as if I'm French, I guess. This 1 meter high collage, so now it's going to stay with us. So this 1 meter high collage, it's lots bigger than it is in real life, but it's still, big. This 1 meter high collage hung for over a century at the top of the staircase on the 3rd floor of Hauteville House, which was Victor Hugo's house in Guernsey, the second island that he took refuge in after fleeing the Napoleon III regime. So I'd like to underline 5 aspects of the work. You can see where it was more or less on the side. If we were the collage, we'd be very close to it if we were 1 floor up. So I'd like to underline 5 aspects of the work that might help us think about representations of exile. First, although the construction of what I'll call the Jersey collage has been attributed to Charles Hugo, who is the 3rd child of Victor Hugo, born in 1828, I believe, and therefore, by the time they wound up on Jersey, who was a young adult. So this specific collage was attributed to Charles, and it represents a collective effort. The entire Hugo family posed for the camera. Some of the photographs were taken by adopted son Auguste Vacquerie. Victor worked with son Charles to conceptualize the center photograph. The poem on the lower left may be in the hand of Madame Adèle. This project of exile time is a group triumph over dislocated space. Second, this collage operated in a material way in the everyday life of the Hugo household in exile. It decorated walls that must have seemed empty when they arrived from Jersey. The collage also had a social function. It worked as a mnemonic device in relation to the dead, labeled Dean, who's the young woman in the image there, and Charles Vacquerie, who's above her, as well as Auguste's cat Grise were represented there. As it decorated the Hugo home for the remainder of Victor Hugo's exile, it would stand in as well for those who departed that exile. Vacquerie, Charles, François Victor, Madame Adèle all had left before he did, and it therefore evoked a phantasmatic family unity that the Guernsey exile did not replicate. Third, it names and shows a place, Jersey, and it gives figurative meaning to that place by repeating on the frames that surround each of the young men of Jersey, Charles, François Victor, and Auguste, exile and prison. Those words are there. That the writing surrounded Victor's portrait, there in the middle, consists not of the figure of exile, but rather of the titles of his published works, does not frame him as any less imprisoned than the young men of his entourage, but suggests his exile has other entitlements than those who arrived on the Channel Islands without a professional past. Fourth, it articulates the fragility of photography. as a photographic medium, and its contrast, oops, have I lost? And its contrast with the gouache and ink painting that remain little altered by time. The tension inherent within this medium that can be reproduced, but which fades through use, emerges through the fact that what lasts best here is singular, the very collage that positioned these mechanically reproduced images in an overall painted structure. The photographs exposed to the light have become ghostly. Fifth, the Jersey collage narrates a past history of this family in much the same way as a photo album. And in that respect, it is a privileged version of what transpires in 13 albums made from what Françoise Halbrun has called photographs of the Jersey atelier. It's marked by one significant way from the albums. It's the only work of the atelier that seems to have been constructed as much to look back out at the household members as to be gazed on by them. Positioned at the top of a staircase where the entire family would have passed every day, the collage ultimately became a lieu de mémoire, or a place of memory, narrating a collective account of exile years from 1852 to 55. Through its choices from the 350 clichés, or 350 individual photographs that were taken in the Jersey atelier, the Jersey collage worked to give significance to an exile that had become an exile from exile. Photography followed soon after the Hugo family arrived in political exile on Jersey in August 1852. There's a map of where they were. 3 months after having joined several hundred banned men of the Second Empire already residing on the island, Adele announced in her journal, that's their daughter, here's our project to make daguerreotypes of everyone in Jersey. Daguerreotyping became quickly such a fad that an even newer technology became necessary. Charles traveled to Caen to study photography with his father's associates, and in spring 1853, up through October 1855, the Hugo family and their friends would pose, create, and print using new calotypic negative processes. The Jersey atelier took shape as Charles Hugo, this is Charles, and Vacquerie, his friend, set about using Talbot's methods, these are Talbot cameras, and processes of paper negatives with salt paper prints, or collodion glass negatives with albumin processed paper. The cast of characters, and now we're going to see a whole bunch of the proscrits or banned men. The cast of characters of the Hugo entourage on Jersey emerges in portraits collected in the albums. The monarchist general Flo there on the left, the Hungarian insurrectionist Teleki and Mézeros, again on the left here, Charles Reberol, who was the editor of a major newspaper called La Réforme, Bonnet Duverdier, who's the guy on the right there, the editor of the refugee newspaper, the paper in Jersey that then went to London in 55, socialist typographer Pierre Leroux, journalist Hennet de Kessler, Republican activist Jules Alix, he's the one on the right, and Dr. Barbier on the left, and then to the visitors, the great author Delphine de Girardin, who actually taught them how to read table-turning signs, which is the other way that they passed their time when they were on Jersey, listening to people from the past bang away at table legs. Along with famous violinist of the era, a journalist named Paul Maurice, Vacquerie's mother, Alix's brother there on the right, and his sister Augustine, for whom the album Alix, which we're going to see in a minute, was made. The photography of the Jersey atelier emerges out of exile, but it does not ever really represent it. Superficially, it substitutes portraits of individuals, family activities, and images of Victor Hugo staged to satisfy curiosity about his elsewhere, what he was up to when he wasn't in Paris. But none of these photographs ever manages to show more than isolated moments in that exile, even if cumulatively these are works that differ strikingly from those of more anodyne forms. Later, for example, the Victor Hugo family vacation, this is the grandchildren about 40 years later, and another from that same period. No single photograph, not even those showing Victor on what was called the Rocher des Proscrits, or the Rock of the Banned, or Lost Among the Dikes, conveys more than a fleeting image of that larger history in which the exile transpired. The albums, like the Jersey collage, come closer to a representation of exile. This is the front page of the Alix album. Through their negotiation of the meanings of exile and the possibilities through which anyone in exile can represent him or herself. What is it about exile that inspires photography? Between 1853 and 55, the Hugo group and their sitters turned exile into a photographic project, and in doing so, they transformed photographic history, gave it new meanings, new operations, new representational frameworks. In 1898-99, Zola likewise turned to photography. That's a Zola photograph there on the left, here in the outskirts of London, during his English exile. The Surrealists later renegotiated the terms for photography's place in art while repositioning themselves in a variety of exiles. Photography looms large today in the work of exiled artists such as the Kabakov, Mona Hatoun, and Lebanese-American Walid Rad. The one on the right is Walid Rad. For the past century and a half, photography and exile have been interconnected to such an extent that it is hard to say whether photography gives life to exile or exile breathes life into photography. As Edward Said pointed out, the displacements of exile have become not only commonplace in our 20th century, but figure as, quote, a potent motif of modern culture, unquote. From the French Revolution with its 100,000 émigrés to the displacements of World War II and current crises in the Middle East, exile has become a key condition of modernity. The multiplying vantage points procured by exile have come to signify a privileged place of cultural and political criticism. Being out of place and out of time has been cast as a positive place for performing the self by theorists of exile, who cite, for example, Theodore Adorno, quote, "Dwelling is now impossible. The house is past. It is part of morality not to be at home in one's house, in one's home," unquote. The photographic accompanies such fragmentation, uncanniness, disembodiment, out-of-placeness, not just because it became the new burning desire of the decades after the 1789 revolution. Rather, the photographic serves exile because it so thoroughly operates in terms of disjunctions in time and space. While for Adorno, writing was potentially a place to live for a man who no longer has a homeland, photography became, for others, a place where exile might be confronted and its significance tested. If exile has exploited its optical moments, photography has been throughout its history bound up in significant ways with exile. Benjamin, here photographed in the Bibliothèque Nationale, imagined, in fact, that the camera makes the person photographed, quote, feel as if in exile, not only from the stage, but from himself. With a vague sense of discomfort, he feels inexplicable emptiness. His body loses its corporeality. It evaporates. It's deprived of reality, life, voice, unquote. When Benjamin transcribed those words, he'd been living in Paris since 1833 in exile. There he posed for Giselle Freund, giving up his own image to the camera. His experience of exile in front of the lens seems pertinent in a number of ways. Quote, operating with his own living person, yet foregoing his aura, unquote, Benjamin imagined the photographic subject exchanging the magic for art, for the plus value of photography, what the theorists called insightfully unconscious optics. The result of exile became for Benjamin a theory of how the camera made its subject feel as if in exile in order to reveal what was not hitherto visible. And there's some great work on Benjamin in exile by T.J. Demas, my colleague in art history. Exile is imprinted in the photographic process nearly from its origins. Here is Talbot's very earliest book on photography, The Pencil of Nature from 1844, that counted the advantages of photography through recourse through a representation of exile. Molah's drawing of Hagar in the desert is chosen there to demonstrate the uses of photography to recall and preserve art at a distance from its original site. If the camera threatens exile, it also promises an afterlife to exile. The paradox is not just in the possibilities framed by these founding moments in the theory and practice of photography. Exile disrupts place and time, as Sylvia Priel has shown in her excellent work on exiles in France or from France. The exiled is nowhere and has nowhere. He does not participate in the present, she writes. This double lack for the exiled of the present in the native land means that in exile, says April, time and space are bound up together. They become interchangeable through the process of loss. Time is lost in space. Photography would seem to be a counterweight to those temporal and spatial shocks. T.J. Demos has written, the crisis of memory would be alleviated by photography, which is peculiarly suited to address this desire for the past. Uniquely situated to stand in for its referent, to create the closest simulation of its original model, the photograph creates a physical connection between viewer and image, reestablishing that link to the past, unquote. But photography is famously duplicitous, a lure that only promises presence. It seems imprinted with the moment in which it was taken, its famous indexicality, but it is only the corpse of that event. Like the exiled person, a photograph is in trouble with space and time. Barthes points to the way the photograph disrupts space and time categories to create spatial immediacy and temporal anteriority, resulting in an illogical conjunction between the here now and the there in the past. The exile turns to the photograph to find out who he is, who he's been, where he is now. But the photograph just frames the empty time and space. And what's more, its fragility, subject to destruction by the very light that made its image possible, threatens further loss down to the trace of color and the very paper surface that once took life from the image's appearance. The Hugos brought to Jersey in 1852 two photographs that they would reproduce repeatedly with calotypic processes and positioned in album after album, as well as in the Jersey collage. Charles Vacquerie and Leopoldine, both dead a few years before, their portraits served, therefore, as the primal scene for the Hugo Atelier's photographic projects. The Hugo entourage used these two images in ways that made them not only photographs as such, in fact, the one of Leopoldine is a drawing, but then photographed. What they brought was a drawing, and then they photographed it. And this is the photograph of the drawing. But that drew on central aspects of uses of painted miniatures. So this is it in the collage. This is an image showing you painted miniatures in their everyday use as imagined in the era just after the French Revolution. Another image, early 19th century, so a few 40 years roughly before, showing people holding a miniature, but also in a miniature by Dagoty. And there again, the image from the collage on the right, what they're doing with their painted miniatures. Staring out from the wall, no longer clearly visible, and they're twice removed from the then-there-ness of a picture, and now put in the picture itself that is the Jersey collage on your screen in yet another picture. Leopoldine and Charles had become relics rather than images. What do we know about what the Hugo entourage would want from their photographic projects in exile? As group leader for this experimental team, Victor projected myriad employments for the new technology and promoted the project through the Jersey years. He didn't handle cameras, he didn't make photographs, he didn't print them. It's all the sons and, to a certain extent, other people in the entourage, but he's very much part of the masterminding of this project. He says, for example, I have great projects. There are all sorts of premeditations in this photography. We are dreaming of illustrating works, or even more making works, altogether new and original. By June of 1853, he writes, it's a photographic revolution. C'est donc la révolution photographique que nous voulons faire. We want to make a photographic revolution, not just a revolution, but a photographic one, he wrote, and appended parenthetically, while we're waiting. In other words, while we're waiting for the revolution, we'll make a photographic one. As if to say that the democratic revolution could come into being through this revolution of photography. Exile constrains people to rethink the social representations for the redeployment of categories and political hierarchies, writes Sylvia Priel. Eva Hoffman has written about how being deframed by exile empowers a kind of vision in which one discovers that even the most interstitial and seemingly natural aspects of our identities and social realities are constructed rather than given, and that they could be arranged, shaped, articulated in quite another way. Hugo's version of this was what Guy Rosat has called a transfiguration in poetics, but also more poignantly, an exploration of the paradoxes within the new languages for politics and culture at his disposal. Here is what a banned man is, a man so taken away from where he belongs that he only has his conscience, so thrown into the darkness that he only retains the sun. I flag this passage not just for the paradoxes of its description of the framework out of which exile's representations become possible, paradoxes which prefigure those of the best postmodern theorists of exile, but also because of the way Hugo figures here the terms out of which an exile's language can be constructed. This is, as Heilbronn has elegantly underlined, the man who calls his son's work with photography a collaboration with the sun. For him, exile is what it means when you make do with the languages that the sun gives you. It is a marriage of what conscience brings to work that is literally given form in the technology of photography. Despite the dead ends of the Jersey Atelier projects, I'm inclined to see the work of the Hugo group as performing a kind of miraculous salvage work in a situation of trauma that Ulrich Baer has conceptualized. He proposes to emphasize photography as a medium of preservation and a rescue of reality that pressures us to imagine what could occur beyond the boundaries of the print. The work of the Jersey Atelier is centered on fabricating an afterlife to exile. The Jersey entourage envisioned explicitly and implicitly using photography in a myriad of ways. They used photography the way travelers did from the outset to see their new surroundings in new ways. Now, here are just a few of the images of those surroundings, in fact. Photographs help people take possession of space in which they are insecure, writes Susan Sontag. Photography was, for the Jersey Atelier, of photographers, a kind of passport, less designed to dissolve social boundaries than simply to lay claim to being from somewhere else and able to go toward somewhere else. Photograph albums and collages ordered these experiences of exile, and here's a daguerreotype showing Mrs. Hugo, Madame Hugo, and son François Victor, taken probably by Charles or Vacquerie. It's not a photo album that they're looking at. It's before photo albums would have existed because they, in part, invented them. But it's an album like the kinds of albums that they're going to create at the end of the Jersey exile before they went to Ghanzi and once they got to Ghanzi. So because photographs and albums ordered those experiences, and they also reinvented its dislocations. Because the photographs existed in multiple copies, unlike the daguerreotype of which there's only one, they could be rearranged, projected in multiple ways on different screens, rescuing the experiences represented there from the danger of embalming of time. The Hugo household had a long-standing experience of albums which had come into use in the late 18th century as collections of specimens, autographs or signatures, musical works, and original drawings. Among the first daguerreotypes of the Jersey Atelier is, in fact, this one, an image that plays on the kind of mise on a beam or thing within a thing that one finds in miniature portraits like the one we saw earlier in the 1820s. In the early 1850s, the photographic album was still, both as a public published project and as a private one, to be imagined. And the Hugos participated actively in generating models for those projects. By putting the photographs in different juxtapositions, giving them narratives, the Hugo albums try out alternative meanings for representing those who are in exile. They also invite new representations for their interlocutors. Here are some other examples of albums shown in images. and this is slightly later than the Hugo. And this is actually in one of the Hugo albums. It's a pre-printed album announcement that would have been used to say, here you can put your music or your flowers here. And then they put their photographs into it. It's the only one that actually uses the pre-printed thing. So by putting the photographs in different juxtapositions, they try out alternative meanings for representing those who are in exile. They invite new representations by their interlocutors. When the albums, such as the one given to Augustin Alix, this is from the Augustin Alix album, explicitly evoked a need to keep a souvenir of Marine Terrace, or a memory of Marine Terrace, they proposed an ongoing memorial function for those to whom they gave their gift, not just to remember what was experienced there, but to give a meaning to those experiences. Souvenir or memory here is singular. Souvenir of Marine Terrace is what's written at the beginning. The album is the souvenir or memory in the sense of a vestige that one takes back from travels, but it is also now the repository, a single fabric woven from already shared signs of the exile. Each album thus had the double function of offering a potential narrative to a shared experience of the Jersey exile and of conveying the job of curator to the recipient of the collection of now souvenirs, plural. All the albums seem to have started out as a blank page bound book, like the one we saw a minute ago. The album Maurice alone has that commercially fabricated album. Only one, the album of the Prescrit, seems to have been compiled in the order the photographs were taken. Half were constructed as gifts. There's even one that, that contains dedications from the moment that Ribeyrolles was leaving, and it wound up, in fact, found later in Brazil. Nearly half the albums were continued by their owners long after the 1850s. Bonnet Duverdier, there on the left, included fundraising posters from his Jersey exile, business cards of himself and his friends, documents from his later political career. There's a unity, too, in the construction of the albums. Almost all the albums begin with an image of Victor Hugo. This is his exile, his family, his album, his story, or at least a story that casts him as the figurehead. Most of the gift albums, like the privately held family album, which is called the Album des Prescrits, or the album of the band, proceed from the Hugo photo through the family. So this is often the first one. Vacqueries includes his cat on the 8th page. I'm sorry, we saw that earlier. Next, all the albums roll out the cast of the band with works using the surroundings of exile in often daring ways. The House of Marine Terrace here turns up about halfway through most albums, rising ghostly out of the penumbra. Shown in photographs as projecting its own light, and yet it remains stark, boxy, and uninviting. Closer up, photographs play on its frontiers and even prison-like conditions in a work showing Hugo's sons with bars of light traversing them. One can't help but wondering, seeing the number of images showing the windows and doors of the greenhouse, or serre, as it was called, what squeezes you, but which also is where plants would have been grown and where they had great light for working with photography. It seems to have doubled as a studio and a community room. There that you go, one wonders if the Hugos knew the early work of Talbot with its similar kinds of windows, and if in making their own window portraits, they were also even winking at him. Again, window portraits of the family. In 1854, Vacqueries explores what he sees from his windows. You saw that earlier. Sorry, it was out of order. These are Vacqueries, what Vacqueries sees from his windows, they're called. Implicitly citing work by both Daguerre that designated such optics as the disembodied work of the new technological apparatus. Even if the length of the pose prevents us from seeing much human interaction, Daguerre's Paris street scenes show bustling activity, a bustling framework for activity, and a little bitty sign of a bootblack who has been glimpsed by the camera. Vacqueries' images, however, show only desolate walled yards and empty landscapes. These images narrate life on an island where there is little to watch besides what one has seen the day before or the day before that. Two photographic tropes in particular mark the shots that show the Hugo household. First, beginning in summer 1853, Hugo and others began posing on the famous rock. Second, the set of images that revolve around the greenhouse, the winter garden behind Marine Terrace. Because of the prominence of the Serre images in both the Jersey collage and the albums, I'm inclined to take them as a central metaphor for the Hugo atelier's representation of exile. Everyone on the right side of the collage, in fact, leans against the greenhouse door panes. While Victor is posed looking out of the greenhouse window from inside, the image taken of him during the greenhouse shoot seems not to have been included in any of the albums, this one here. But it shows him in a very different relationship to that space. In their experiments at the greenhouse door, the Hugo entourage echoes two famous Talbot images, which we saw earlier, the oriel window at Laycock Abbey and the soliloquy of the broom. Just as in the Talbot image of the broom, which I'm sorry I don't have here, posed strategically on the threshold, the Hugo's family members situated at the door of the greenhouse seem to invite the viewer inside the room and yet leave that space filled with anxious shadows. Carol Armstrong has remarked of the Talbot image that its spatial illusion of a dim windowed interior replicates the photographic camera itself, the darkroom with aperture, so like the space where the photographs would be made. And it signals photography's conflation of the indexical, the see, this was there, and the metonymic, something like that was there. Photography in the hands of the Hugos makes exile into something you see furtively represented at the frontiers of dark spaces. The albums almost all end with a landscape, or they have a landscape very close to the end. Vaccarier's album concludes with a devastating portrait of the Jersey snow. The album of the Proscrits moves almost exclusively within the portraits before turning on page 50 out of 60 to what Vaccarie sees from his window, what you saw earlier, and then to the ghostly Marine Terrace image. The two albums conclude with Hugo in front of the dikes. One album ends with a picturesque Guernsey portscape. The album Alix ends with a photograph of a cemetery. Hugo writes in a letter to his beau-frère, his brother-in-law, in 1868, "I am nothing more than a band man and a conquered man. Je ne suis rien qu'un proscrit et un vaincu." But the photographic albums of the Jersey studio are about being anything but a proscrit or band man, and especially not a conquered one. What makes the portraits of the adults in them so fascinating is not the physicality of the images or even the style of the portraits, but rather the enormous care taken to make likenesses and not art. The juxtaposition through the albums of the portraits of the band and the family with the vacant landscapes seen from the household windows and the ruins of Jersey captured on outings ultimately procures a different relationship of time and space than those one finds in either public photographs in travel collections or private family albums later. Unlike the visitable photographic images of public albums of the 19th century, neither are these the habitable views that Bott imagines as the ideal subjects of the photographic landscape. The Jersey albums instead procure a kind of haunted time and space. Unlike vacation photographs that figure their owner's passage through the world, making space seem to result from the taking of the picture, the Hugo albums and the Jersey collage resist inviting anyone into the grip of the Serre or the greenhouse. The works themselves seem to stumble, stutter, shudder at the implications of what a souvenir of Marine Terrace's exile might become. Some years after leaving Jersey, Hugo evoked its landscape, recalling how you imagine seeing there a grave with windows, as if the house was a grave with windows that allowed ghosts or specters to see out. What is politically subversive and aesthetically challenging about the albums and collages of Marine Terrace is that they invite the viewer to experience the inhospitable. These are not places where one can live. they elaborate. This is not a time you can use. The albums become, in effect, the letters of transit for those in exile, letting them make safe passage into other territories. The Jersey collage, however, stays behind. It names the place, it figures the exile as a prison, it positions those who shared the exile on boundaries, it invites the viewer to take them indexically as having been there. It invites the viewer to see the exiled as still lost on the edge of the winter garden. It watches for decades on the staircase of Hauteville House, becoming itself the window through which you can see the specters of exile looking out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jann. I think we have a few minutes for questions, if there are any.
Thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting. There were two pictures that I really loved. Well, the one I loved most was him amongst the rocks. And he certainly didn't look like a bandstand or a conquered man. And I was just thinking how important photographs were. For instance, you see the photograph of Oscar Wilde, you only see him as an older man, where you see, not as a younger man. You see the Holocaust photographs which are being captured. But if you were to put some of these photographs in, say, the production of Les Miserables in the auditorium, imagine how the perception of the modern person seeing his lively mind and then seeing the reality of where he lived. I think it was really incredible, bringing it to our attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a point about Les Miserables. One thing that's important to remember is that they're thrown out of Jersey. They're like thrown out for political reasons, and then they go to Guernsey, and that's where Les Miserables is actually written. So in one respect, one could see Les Miserables as being the project that Hugo himself takes on that follows the photographs. If the photographs are one attempt to have a revolution through representation, Les Miserables becomes a second attempt to do that. And it's the one that we today probably remember the most from that period, although there are other much more politically active things that had immediate impacts at the time, and certainly poetry that's incredibly important.
I just remembered the other photograph that I loved so much was him writing at the desk, because that seemed to really capture him with the environment and how different from where they were posing, three in a crowd. I thought that was incredible. Roger Fenton, of course, he was the first photographic archaeologist of the British Museum. If you look at his, you get the same sort of feeling of the environment, and it brings it to life more than some of the modern digital colored photographs. It really gives us, as you said, it invites us in the shadows to see a perceived reality, and I think they're invaluable, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, please, sir.
It might be slightly sort of going against the grain of your concept, but given that photography at that time was a very long process, was it simply a matter of giving the rest of the family something to do while he got on with his writing?
Well, I mean, considering how much he had to stand there, how long he had to stand there, even in the bright sunlight, in order for there to be those photographs that could be then smuggled back to France to people who needed to remember what possibilities the band, Hugo and others, still could give them, and what hope they could still give them. It was a lot of work for him too, and he's in, gosh, I don't know statistically, of the 350 images, I'd say that he's in a third. There's a good third that are an attempt to archive you know, the individuals there. But what they're mostly doing in that 2.5-year period is table turning. And the writing that's happening heavily there, I wrote a piece earlier, which is how I actually got interested in the photography, about the table turning, which at the time I was working on it, very few people had done much on it because there was a lot of anxiety about what it meant for Victor Hugo and his entire family to spend 2 years sitting with their hands in the dark on a table waiting for it to tap out messages from everyone from Shakespeare to the still alive Napoleon III, who was imagined somehow as disembodied, kind of Salem witch trials, sort of like, you know, sending a spirit over to give him trouble, or and they talked with all manner of great writers and great politicians and got all sorts of advice from them. Now, the person who actually was doing the writing, as well as the medium in this job, was not Victor. But he was very much at the center of it, and you know, was the person who was asking the questions of the table, who was then obediently tapping out what needed to be said, as it were. But the really lion's share of that work, other than a lot of political tracks, in that 2-year period, were this massive manuscript of the tables. So whereas it's tempting to kind of see the Victor Hugo of Notre Dame de Paris or Hunchback of Notre Dame from 1830 as being the Victor Hugo who has other things to do. So would François Victor please get on with translating Shakespeare? Could Adele keep her diary? Could Madame get busy? And don't forget that he has his mistress down the way as well, although less so in Jersey than he will have her in Guernsey. And it's a kind of elaborate project for him to keep everyone busy on things that they can all meaningfully work on. It's about having family projects in exile, in part. But it's not so. It's not the Victor Hugo who's like up there at the top of Hauteville House, not letting anyone come to see him. It's a very different world in Marine Terrace, where it's really basically one floor, and they all kind of have to hang out together. So. My sense would be that he's there all the time. And although he probably is doing a lot of writing while they take photographs of him, he's incredibly invested in what the photography turns out to be, just in ways that are much more explicit and much more visible, literally visible, than, say, François Victor's translation of Shakespeare, which he goes on to be a really important translator of Shakespeare for France.
I think that's all we have time for today, unfortunately, because we're quite strict on time with the lunch hour lectures. But perhaps you can ask Jann a question later, and I think you need to come back next year and tell us all about this table turning business, Jann. Thank you again very much.
Thank you very much.